Chapter 11. It was almost morning. The deep blue of the night sky was slowly giving way to deep grays and could not much longer hold off the inevitable dawn, no matter how much Beck wanted it to. He sat in one of the rockers, gently massaging his aching leg and his broken ego. He wasn't really hurt, not in any meaningful physical way. There were no broken bones, no obvious bruises, but there was a wound, and it cut completely through him to that secret place within us all where ourselves are most protected, and the pain was unnameable. For almost 5 hours it had gone on, relentless, implacable, carefully planned techniques guaranteed to obtain the desired results, to ensure against lies, to anticipate and circumvent trained defenses and improvised trickery. Newman had learned well from his Russian teachers. Beck told Newman the little that he knew. Why not? The man had a right to know, and he would find out eventually anyway. How couldn't he? Already Beck was beginning to view Newman openly, in the way that he'd always thought of him secretly, as a force of nature, a human leviathan, capable of anything, anywhere, anytime. What Kapf had called the Übermensch, the unstoppable Superman of Nietzsche's dreams and other philosophers' nightmares. It didn't take long before he told Newman of Patricia's theory, as much as he understood of it anyway. He told Clemente's theory of his case, how he'd even told him Mont's theory of Newman's anti-establishment neurosis. But he'd left out Kapf. Why? Even now he had no clear idea. But hang on to it he did, with the persistence of an oyster to a pearl he would not let Newman see. Newman had been considerate, at least as considerate as a torturer could be to his victim. He could have pressed harder, caused more, deeper physical pain, but he'd intentionally held back from it. It was as if even now, with all the barriers stripped away, with all the bullshit that had passed between them, flushed into the dank sewer of their past lives, he couldn't bring himself to really torture Beck. Too much had passed between them for that. But he could ask his questions, and he could demand his answers. He'd asked about the searchers. Who was commanding them? What was he like? Where were they based? How many? Where? When? But always he came back to the one central theme. Why? And always Beck's answer remained the same. Orders from higher authority. Beck had expected that to enrage Newman, to drive him into an emotional and physical fury that would end the session there and then, maybe mercifully forever. But his response had always been the same. From whom? On what authority? What do they know? Why? Then they would start again. The answers would pour out like thickening blood from a held-open wound. Slower, ever slower, but constantly and with no end in sight. Patricia, evolution. Clemente, disease. Mont, neurosis. And Beck's mind raced. Don't tell him Kapf. Never Kapf. Don't talk about Kapf. Hold it back. Save something. Beat him at something. Gotta have a win. Just one win. Gotta have something. Anything. Oh gosh, my gosh, where are you? Over here, please? No. Mustn't call. G-O-D. No. He might notice. Can't let him see. Can't let him find out. Oh, hell. Save me. Then it was over. Newman helped him to bed, carefully tended his chafed and rope-burn wrist and ankle, got him a cool, damp towel from the bathroom, some cold water to soothe the dry throat. I'll have some ice sent up for that shoulder, Newman had said calmly. Maybe they have some liniment or something. He'd started for the door, then turned back. If you leave this room in less than 3 hours, you'll be dead. After that, I don't care what you do." He paused, seeming to study his former mentor. "You're an interesting man, General, an interesting man. It's a shame you don't have a clue about what's going on." "I know," Beck muttered. "What was that?" "I know. Do you?" Newman walked back, looking him over with a surgeon's stare. The jaw set, the expression resolved, the eyes red with exhaustion and pain. Looking up at Newman, not with fear of dying or of more pain, but something else entirely. A deep, soul-tearing fear, like a soothsayer seeing not his own death in his crystal balls, but the deaths of many, hundreds, thousands, millions, everyone. The two men had stared at each other for over 2 minutes. Then Newman had slowly nodded. "Good." Again, Newman started for the door. "But whatever you do," he laughed, "do it under your own name, okay? The other's just too embarrassing." He turned, leaving the room, chuckling to himself. Beck straightened in the chair. Slowly he began unbuttoning his shirt, then carefully removed his shoes and socks. 5 minutes later, he stood naked in the room, his clothes folded neatly in proper GI fashion at the foot of his bed. "I've lived one day too long," he muttered as he walked into the bathroom suite. A moment later, the shower could be heard running. One day too long. On the other side of Munich, at Fürstenfeldbruck Air Station, a variation of the thought was being echoed. "Too long," Runoff thought as he waited for his Ilyushin Airbus to stop its rollout. "He's been loose too long." The non-stop flight from St. Petersburg through stormy weather had left the former detention barracks commander moody and foul-tempered. Or perhaps it had been the dispatches that he'd received. Either way, he was determined that there was going to be hell to pay. In the finest traditions of the Spetsnaz commandos, where he'd proudly served before being exiled as a prison guard, Runoff kept his face a blank as he stood in the endless customs line. It was easy, considering his mind was elsewhere. News of Newman's escape had sent shockwaves through that small part of the Russian intelligence community that was familiar with his case. Those who had tried to arrest him almost 7 years before drank toasts of success to the men who would now have to try and catch him. Those who had tried to interrogate him saw it as divine retribution to the Americans who had created him. And those who had imprisoned him, people like Colonel Runoff and the surviving guards of Detention Barracks 6210, said private prayers or kneeled in dark churches, praying that he would be caught before, or they flew through storms to Munich. 40 minutes later, Runoff cleared customs. He looked for his contact in the reception lounge, then recognized the appropriate identification procedure, and fell into step alongside the tall man who had met with Tabbert. "Is everything ready?" Runoff kept his voice down as they walked. "As far as I could with the information on hand," the tall man responded. They climbed into a Volkswagen van that was double-parked at the curb, a Munich tradition. "Have there been any sightings?" "No." "Any leads?" "None." Runoff allowed his mind to flash over every possibility. "Do we know as certain that the Americans still believe that the man is in the country?" The tall man pulled onto the Autobahn and accelerated to 110 kilometers per hour. "There appears to be a dispute within the search team. The commander has asked for permission to redouble his efforts within 75 kilometers of the Institute on the advice of one of the doctors attached to his team. Higher command believes that the man has already left the country. Runoff thought it over. What does our expert say? The tall man smiled. We will find out over breakfast, Colonel, I promise you. He sensed Runoff's growing unease. Don't worry, sir. If he's still here, we'll find him for you. Runoff nodded and stared out the window. The tall man drove on, occasionally sneaking glances at Runoff. So, the driver said at length, what has this bastard done to draw a full colonel of the Northern Security Command after his ass? Runoff just kept staring out the window. Nothing yet, he mumbled. I hope. An hour after sunrise, similar thoughts pervaded the mostly empty search headquarters. As it slowly geared up for the day's activities, those few actually in the HQ moved around almost in a daze. They had been working flat out for 35 days, following every lead, searching out every possibility, no matter how unlikely, never finding so much as a scent of their quarry. It was a thoroughly unprecedented situation for this elite urban search unit, and throughout, Newman's enormous face looked down on them with what seemed like unhidden delight. Tabbert wandered into the converted barn, nodding at some of the early morning staff. He smiled and accepted a cup of bad coffee. He made small talk about the weather. Finally, he made his way to the overnight desk, the center of communications through which all reports and leads from the night before were channeled. Good morning, Sergeant, he said in his most professionally friendly voice. How are you this fine morning? The tired man rubbed his eyes. I wouldn't know. You're the doc. Tabbert laughed despite his personal revulsion for that particular word. You look no worse than the other men, he said gently. The sergeant smiled. That bad? Tabbert shrugged. Our problem child has been keeping you all very busy, has he not? It's like he fell off the face of the planet, the sergeant said wearily. I've never seen anything like it before. He shook his head. It's damn frustrating. Tabbert motioned toward a chair beside the man. The sergeant pulled it out, and Tabbert sat down next to him. You know, perhaps it would do you good to talk to someone about this. I have mentioned to Captain Kilgore that my staff remains available to provide whatever counseling you men may need. The sergeant smiled. Who has the time for that? Right now we're 16 hours on and 8 off. That leaves just about enough time to eat and sleep. He paused. Assuming we don't have to scramble after another false lead in the middle of the night. It sounds very stressful, Tabbert prompted. The young man laughed, and then some. Tabbert looked around, then slid his chair closer to the man. If you would like to talk. I don't think so, sir, the sergeant responded. No offense, but security is job one around here. Tabbert smiled like a patient parent. Of course, as it should be, his gentle, guiding voice said. But, you know, I possess top secret and above clearance. Many of my senior staff do. A necessary byproduct of the important work the Institute does for your government. He pulled out his plastic embossed access card and showed it to him. The sergeant examined it closely. I didn't know that, he said, clearly impressed. So, if it would make you feel better to unburden yourself, he said, smiling a fatherly smile, I would be only too pleased to listen. The young man looked around the room at the growing numbers of staff that were filing in. He shook his head. I don't know if the other guys knew about it. Tabbert stood up and patted the young man on the back. I completely understand, he said easily. Your shift is over when? In 15 minutes. The sergeant nodded. Tabbert assumed a serious expression. And if, when your shift is over, you decided to take a walk outside, and if on that walk, say, by the field, we should happen to meet and walk together for a time, that would be completely innocent, would it not? Yeah, it would. Two comrades taking a walk in the morning freshness, passing the time. It could be most, he actually winked, therapeutic, no? A brief nod was his answer as the sergeant returned to sorting some papers in front of him. It's getting a little busy now, Doctor. I have to get all this done before the end of my shift. Tabbert half bowed. Of course. Forgive the interruption, please. He turned back toward the room. I think I will take a little walk by the field just outside for a time. He wandered away, greeting and talking small talk to various staffers as they reported for the shift change. The sergeant watched him go, shook his head, then returned to his work. The guy's not such an asshole after all, he muttered, before taking a phone call. 2 hours later, in the small coffee shop in the Reich district, Tabbert sat down at a booth across from the tall man and Ruinoff. Madalena, the tall man said quietly, I would like to introduce you to my partner from Moscow, Sergei Jov. He turned to Ruinoff. Sergei, it is my most inestimable pleasure to introduce you to our hardest and most faithful worker, Madalena. Ruinoff reached across the table and took Tabbert's hand. Doctor, he said softly, but with deep respect, it is indeed a profound honor to meet a man with the courage, fortitude, intelligence, and fidelity of yourself. Tabbert beamed as they shook hands. You know, Ruinoff continued, I have admired your work for a long time and feel personally flattered that you would agree to see me on such short notice. Tabbert waved the compliment away. Please, Herr Jove, anything I can do to assist your noble company is my honor. Ruinoff nodded. The man was exactly as his file and the tall man's description had said. Self-involved, self-important, and obsequious. I do not mean to be rude, Ruinoff pressed, leaning forward, but I understand you can give us an update on the, shall we call it, the situation. Of course, Tabbert replied. As an important official myself, I understand the demands upon you. He puffed himself up to his full, inadequate height. Thank you for understanding, Ruinoff smiled, pushing down his inclination to slap the man in front of him. It is nothing. Now then, to business. He looked around the half-empty coffee shop carefully before he spoke again. I have obtained the latest updates from the search unit, effective as of 0700 today. Ruinoff turned to the tall man. He is everything I'd read of and more. Amazingly, he didn't get sick to his stomach as he said it. Please go on, Madalena, the tall man said. Tabbert pulled out a small notebook and referred to it as he talked. Ruinoff cringed. For an agent to carry written notes was among the most forbidden things. But he needed this man more than he needed to discipline him. At least for now. There have been 3 new developments since my last report, he paused. You received that, or would you like me to recapitulate? Please go on, Doctor. Your earlier reports were most thorough and enlightening. Tabbert preened. As you wish. He checked his notes. First, the search unit has been ordered to demonstrate some concrete results within 72 hours, or they are going to be returned to barracks. Indeed. Yes, their frustration level has grown very high. I understand that this is the first time they have ever failed in subduing their prey. They are taking it most personally. Forgive me for interrupting, Doctor. Not at all. I want you to feel free to have me elucidate any of the details that perplex you, Herr Job. I am an expert after all. As I am well aware, Doctor, he paused, why, in your opinion, have they been unable to capture the man? Tabbert seemed to think it over carefully. The rigidity of their command structure is such that, in my expert opinion, they are unable to adapt to the ever-changing conditions of the chase. This has placed them in an impossible position when dealing with a psychopath who acts without reason or structure. Brunoff nodded, appearing impressed, as he decided that there would be nothing to gain by asking Tabbert for opinions. Please go on with your report, he said with a smile. The second development is more bizarre yet. One of my senior staff, Otto Kapf, has foolishly convinced the commander of the search unit to pull men back from the outer search areas in order to concentrate on the villages and towns around the Institute. He has deluded himself that the man, has formed some kind of salmon-esque attachment to the place and will be found not far from it. The look on Tabbert's face was of complete disgust. Brunoff thought it over. He'd read the file on Kapf and been impressed. The man had a reputation for conservatism, thoroughness, and intuitive insight. Any theory of his must be given careful consideration, despite what this fool postured. And the third development, if I'm not being premature, Doctor? Yes, the third development. He smiled. It would appear that the man with the titular charge of the search has gone missing. General Beck? The very same. Go on, Doctor, you have my rapt attention, Brunoff said. He pictured the man whose file he'd so carefully studied on the flight from Russia. A man so much like himself. Warriors no longer allowed in battle. Practiced killers whose only goal, desire, prayer was the end of a human plague, the end of Brian Newman. He tried to focus on what Tabbert was saying. The general was scheduled to brief Washington this morning at 4 o'clock by Autobahn secured circuits. When he failed to arrive in time, Captain Kilgore, the unit's commander, was called in. He ordered the general brought into headquarters, but the men he sent found the general's quarters unoccupied, his bed unslept in. Indeed, the tall man said, for the first time truly impressed by Tabbert's information. Yes, the doctor continued, they have not yet informed Washington, but they have begun a search for him. Do they have any theories? Brunoff pressed, his mind creating its own answers. Tabbert shrugged. If they have, they are keeping them to themselves at the moment. However, I will continue to probe, he paused. I have, of course, my own theory on the matter. He seemed to be waiting to be asked. Please, Doctor, I would be most appreciative of any assistance you can give me. But Brunoff really didn't pay attention as the man talked. Tabbert made a show of thinking. I have observed the general at close proximity for many months, and I have reached certain conclusions about him. He possesses an inferior personality construct, lacks personal discipline, often overreacts to even the most mild criticism. He paused. It is my opinion that he has succumbed to the pressure of the situation and is off somewhere getting drunk. They will undoubtedly find him passed out in some gutter. Brunoff was quiet for a long time after that. The tall man continued the doctor's debriefing, but Brunoff knew the man had nothing more of value to offer, so he let his mind wander. To Kapf, to Beck, and always to Newman. Half an hour away from the coffee shop, safely secured in his grocery, Newman spread out his early morning purchases. A container of coffee, a bag of sausages wrapped in pastry, 2 newspapers, some tape, and 30 marker pens in assorted colors. He uncovered the coffee, took a bite of the sausages, and began to work. Slowly, carefully, he took each page of the papers and taped them in double layers over the front windows. Several times in the 20 minutes that it took, he went outside to make sure that no one could see in. Finally satisfied, he laid out the markers on a small card table he'd purchased and turned to the walls. The work was hard, done mostly from memory in several books that he bought especially for the occasion. After half an hour, he tied a bandana around his forehead to keep the sweat out of his eyes. He worked in pencil first, carefully drawing the outlines, erasing, adjusting height for dimension, erasing, changing the spatial axis, the forms slowly becoming clear along the wall canvas. Then he turned to the pens, painstakingly selecting the right color for the right locus. He balanced shadings, played with perspective and contour, altered the original outlines to conform to his vision in progress. He experimented on darkening, lightening, putting color on color, all with an eye to the eventual finished product. By mid-morning it had become clear that it would take him most of the day, perhaps even into the night. It would require at least one more trip to the stationery store for more markers, but he couldn't stop until it was done. It was too important a part of his newly formed grand design. Across town, breaking his long-standing tradition of never being seen in the playground before 1500, Ghislaine pulled his Mercedes into the garage of his club. After setting the alarm, closing and locking the garage, he walked out into the alley, then froze. He didn't know why. There was no reason, really, but being in the same spot where he'd last seen Apollyon gave him chills. He looked around, assuring himself that the alley was empty, carefully avoided looking up the fire escape, and let himself into the club by the side door. First stop, his office. Opening the credenza, he rewound the video from the hidden cameras in the stairway. He settled into his chair, watching the speeding images of his girls, their clients, racing up and down the stairs at breakneck pace, all carefully time-indexed. He uncovered his styrofoam cup of coffee and began to drink when suddenly a fleeting image caught his attention. He rewound the tape and played it back in slow motion. Timestamp 05:23. Apollyon walks jauntily down the stairs, completely unaware of his being photographed. Ghislaine shook his head. The man had been up there with the other man for over 4 hours. He pushed all thoughts of what mess might await him in the attic as he settled back to finish his coffee before beginning the cleanup. Abruptly, he jumped forward, spilling his coffee on his lap and shirt. Timestamp 05:25. Apollyon, out of nowhere, leans into the secreted camera sight and studies it carefully, then smiles and waves. A large palm covers the camera for 30 seconds, then it lifts, and all is clear again. Cursing his clumsiness, trying desperately to regain his nerve and calm his heart, Ghislaine changed into a running suit that he kept in the office. Then, ignoring the dull pain in his temples, he headed out up the steps. Halfway up the first flight, he paused to stare at a large circle that had been drawn around one of the mirrored side panels. It was precisely at the spot where the camera had been so cleverly concealed. On the top, bottom, and both sides were large arrows pointing in toward the center. Above it, in German, French, and English, was the word camera. Rubbing his forehead, he swallowed some downers and continued up the stairs. At the attic door, he took a deep breath, tried the knob, and opened the door. He had seen many things on the days after he had left the attic room. Bodies, body parts, blood, dead animals, all were part of the way things went, but something about this scene made him stop and mutter a silent prayer. Hanging from the hook that Apollyon had installed, swinging at the end of a doubled-up curtain cord, was the first man that Apollyon had sought, the man whom he had lured to this room last night. He was fully dressed, immaculately so. His hair was combed and gelled in place. He had shaved recently, smelled like he had bathed, and his shoes appeared to have been freshly cleaned. His eyes were open, staring not ahead but straight up, as if he had been watching the rope at the moment of his death. His head was lolling over onto his left shoulder. His arms hung loosely at his side, and shoved under his watchband was a folded piece of paper. Ghislaine carefully reached out and pulled it free. He unfolded it, reading the 3 words scrawled there: duty, honor, country. He shook his head and pocketed the paper. Ordinarily, his next steps would be routine, but Apollyon had carefully instructed Ghislaine on what he should do if he discovered the first man's lifeless body when he arrived in the morning. Carefully, he straightened the stool that had been clearly kicked away by the suicide, lifted the dead man's weight onto his shoulder, and cut the cord. He laid the body on the floor. The noose was removed from his neck. His pockets were carefully searched for any other notes. Then he was carefully and completely undressed. Ghislaine didn't like any of it, was repulsed by the tasks, but Apollyon had demanded that it be done this way, and he was not prepared to cross Apollyon, not yet anyway. He went to the closet, pulling out the package that he knew would be there, and dressed the corpse in the clothes Apollyon had provided. He was careful, as Apollyon had ordered, to change the man's underwear, which had become soiled by the hanging. After a half hour, it was done. He checked that he still had the sealed envelope that Apollyon had given him expressly for this contingency, and pulled out his cellular phone, dialing a number. It answered on the 3rd ring. Ghislaine? Yeah. Shut up and listen. I got a special, okay? Yeah. The attic. No. I said no. This one is not to go in the river. I know, but I'm willing to pay extra, okay? Good. Now, here's what you must do. 2 hours later, just after 1300, a U.S. government car pulled to a stop outside a small house owned by the Institute. Kilgore, the driver, got out, followed by Katz. They looked around, then started up the path to the door. I don't buy it, Doctor, Kilgore was saying, continuing their conversation from the car. The way you describe him, the things you say. He paused. You make him out to be some kind of Superman. He laughed as he knocked on the door. I'll believe that when I see the red S on his chest. I never called him a Superman. I use Nietzsche's term Übermensch, which means the same thing, right? Not precisely. Übermensch means over man, a remaining, a sharpening, and improving of man, but still man, yet capable of almost anything because of his constant evolutionary refinements. Kilgore knocked again. Now you're talking semantics. There was still no answer, so Kilgore pulled out a key and opened the door. Hello? General Beck, sir, it's Kilgore. Hello? He looked over at Cap. Still gone. They walked in, closing the door behind them. They wandered through the hallway into the living room. The house seemed orderly, clean, and completely empty. Side note, page 277, I guess at some point I tore it out of the book because it's not here. I can see like a little bit, like a couple of words at the bottom of the page from where I tore it. So I don't know what's on pages 277 and 278, but continuing on to 279. Cap shook his head. He is not here, he mumbled, as Kilgore moved out of earshot. With a deeply sad expression, Cap walked over to the bed, checked Beck's pulse to confirm the obvious, then began a visual examination of the man. He noted the discoloration around the throat, tested how easily the head moved, and reached his opinion. Kilgore returned 5 minutes later to find Cap sitting on a nearby chair reading a piece of paper. The place is empty and locked tight, Kilgore said as he put away his gun. Cap ignored him, so he looked at Beck. Can you tell what happened to him? Cap never looked up from his reading. He was hanged. Whether voluntarily or not, I cannot say. He continued reading. Kilgore shook his head and walked over to the doctor. What's that? He asked, gesturing at the paper. Cap continued reading, handing Kilgore an envelope. It was beneath his hands. It was addressed simply, to all my friends on shore. What's it say? Kilgore reached out for the paper. Cap looked up, surprised by the outstretched hand in front of him. I will read it to you, he said simply. Then he began. Gentlemen and ladies, if there are any present, I commit to you the physical remains of Brigadier General Alexander Chamberlain Beck, Army of the United States. I rely on your humanity to see that he receives a proper military burial with honors. I assure you he is deserving of one, not only because of his exemplary record, up to a few years ago, of course, but also because he fell in the line of duty, a soldier's noblest end. The specifics of his death are not important. I assume, of course, that I will be held responsible. There is both truth and untruth in that statement, but I accept it nonetheless. One thing about it you should know, as it is indicative of the man that he once was, is that all of your experts, your muddled psychiatrists, your shiny aluminum soldiers, your review bores, he is the one that first came upon me. Now, to the point. Now, to my point. I bear no significant animosity toward any of the individuals charged with my detention and, in parentheses, such as it was, treatment. I accept your flaccid explanation that you are merely looking out for my best interests. Now that is no longer necessary. I wish only to close out a bit of unfinished business, then move on. Allow me this privilege of my birthright as an American, and all will be well. I will go on with my life, and you will be allowed to go on with yours. If you do not allow me this simple thing, ... Sincerely, Brian Newman. Kilgore reached out and took the offered letter, quickly skimming it. It seems I owe you an apology, Doctor. He is still around. Kat stood up and walked to a window, staring out at the street beyond in silence, as Kilgore picked up the phone. It was just after 9 p.m. when Newman stood back, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and smiled. The drawing was more primitive than he'd planned, coarser, more raw, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Its vibrant colors, sharp images, and vivid depictions created exactly the effect he'd hoped for. Touching it in several areas to make sure it was dry, he carefully hung a sheet from 3 nails above it, covering the mural completely. Then he sat down, looking at the off-white sheet, but actually picturing the reactions of the intended viewers when at last it was unveiled. Will it have the desired effect? Does it go far enough or too far? Years from now, when the students and professors argue over its meaning, will any of them truly divine its buried secret? He stood, cleaned himself off, changed into a dark running suit, and left the grocery. The gallery had been prepared. It was time to deliver the invitation.